Mosaic, a daily news program from Worldlink TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome to the news of the hour from Abu Dhabi television. The U.S. forces arrest 3 officials from Saddam Hussein's regime, and they are Minister of the Military Industry Abdel Mullah Hwaish, Iraqi Vice President and member of the Revolutionary Council Taha Muhyiddin Maruf, and Mizdan Khidr Hadi, a former member of the Revolutionary Council. Explosions were heard near the presidential complex in Baghdad after the U.S. forces detonated several landmines and live bombs. A tense calm overwhelms the city of Fallujah in Iraq. Now to our correspondent there, Hani Amara.
There is an overwhelming feeling of tense calm in Fallujah, which has been transformed into an American military base since the Americans called for more reinforcements. They are preparing for possible confrontations with Iraqi citizens, who are furious over the deaths and injuries caused over the last 4 days.
Tens of thousands of Gaza residents walked in a funeral procession for the martyrs of Al-Shuja'iyya massacre, which was committed by the Israeli occupation forces. From Gaza, our correspondent Hazem Badaru.
After Friday prayers, tens of thousands of Palestinians walked in a funeral procession for the martyrs of the Al-Shuja'iyya massacre. The massacre was in response to the roadmap. 13 Palestinians were martyred, including 3 brothers. The Palestinian factions completely refused to hand over their weapons or discuss the issue of illegal weapons, assuring that their weapons will only be used to confront the Israeli occupation.
The severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, continues to spread around the world. Meanwhile, China admits that it is unable to contain the spread of the disease and opens the first SARS hospital. The U.S. Central Command said that they arrested former Iraqi Minister of the Military Industry Abdel Mullah Hwaish, Iraq's Vice President and member of the Revolutionary Council Taha Muhyiddin Maruf, and Mizdan Khidr Hadi, a former member in the Revolutionary Council. Hwaish was the 16th name on the U.S. most wanted list of 55 people. Meanwhile, Maruf is the 42nd name on the list. He was not close to Saddam Hussein and seldomly appeared in public or gave public statements. Among the arrested is Mizdan Khidr Hadi, and he is the 41st name on the U.S. most wanted list. Hadi was a former military commander and one of the Al-Ba'ath party leaders. A number of explosions shook Baghdad following the U.S. forces' detonation of landmines and live bombs in one of the presidential complex on the west bank of the Tigris River. Meanwhile, eyewitnesses reported hearing more explosions from other areas in Baghdad. It is believed to be the sound of ammunition exploding. A UN team of 21 employees returned to their offices in Baghdad for the first time after leaving Iraq on March 18th. According to the UN Relief and Aid Office, their employees will evaluate the power and water plants which were destroyed during the war. They will also secure the food warehouses for the Iraqis. Arab and Kurdish tribal leaders in Mosul are preparing for elections on May 5th to elect a city administration council in light of the ongoing breaches of security in Mosul. Now we go to our correspondent Ahmed Herzallah for more details.
This man was killed in front of passerbyers in Al-Mosul, and no one did anything. Meanwhile, citizens' homes are being looted. They're paying the price of chaos and political instability. These incidents and calls for help are repeated daily on the city's streets. This man was killed in the middle of the street. Who will defend his rights? I am asking you, who will defend his rights? Yes, who will defend his rights, and the rights of those who were chased away from their homes? Hundreds of residents want to know the fate of their seized homes, demanding that the Kurdish leader immediately intervene to solve the problem. There are 800 homes in Domes Faraya, 60 kilometers north of Al-Mosul. There are Arab, Kurdish, Yazid, Shabath, and Turkoman families living there. The Kurdish forces are not allowing us in now. They say that it is a disputed area under Kurdish control. Of course it is not a disputed area, or anything. The U.S. forces ordered that we return, but we are scared to go back without any protection. I hope that our voices can get to Mr. Masoud al-Barzani to provide us with protection so we can return to our homes. Tribal leaders in Al-Mosul are moving towards finding a solution for the current deteriorating situation, intensifying their communication with the U.S. command in Al-Mosul and in northwestern Iraq. They are trying to form a city administration responsible for security and civil life. However, the picture remains unclear. What role can they play, while the daily life does not seem like it is getting back to normal? As President Bush said, America has to provide security, rebuild the country, and leave. We are waiting for that day, but first we want them to stabilize the country. We need honest people in this situation. As for the tribes, they have the external affairs and have their rights. But when it comes to internal affairs, I know more since I am from here. I know who is good and who is bad. I know who is guilty, an opportunist, and who is honest. But now we need honest people. It is expected that on May 5th, a governor or head of administration will be elected by Al-Mosul's prominent figures and tribal leaders. Meanwhile, the people's condition in the city is not good. Chaos and violence continue to ravage the city. Ahmed Herzala, Abu Dhabi TV, Al-Mosul, Iraq.
Loud explosions went off in Baghdad on Friday near the former presidential palace compound of Saddam Hussein, where U.S. forces are now installed. 4 blasts shook the city in quick succession and were followed a while later by 4 more. It appeared that U.S. forces were destroying ordnance, and correspondents said all 8 explosions came from exactly the same site in the compound area. Meanwhile, around 200 demonstrators marched in central Baghdad Friday to demand compensation for the death and destruction caused by a munitions dump blast on April the 26th. At least 6 people died and dozens were wounded in the incident, which rocked the southern Baghdad district of Za'faraniya a week ago. In other parts of Iraq, Friday prayers passed without major incident, with some clerics and preachers calling for their countrymen to show patience with the coalition military forces, while others called for the U.S. and British troops to leave the country. Palestinian resistance group Hamas has promised bloody retribution for an Israeli raid that left one of its leaders and 11 other people dead, as thousands gathered for their funeral in Gaza City. Some 50,000 Palestinians poured out of Gaza City's mosques after a funeral procession for the Palestinians who were killed by an army raid on a Gaza neighborhood Thursday. The Israeli attack on the military leader of Hamas also killed 11 Palestinian civilians in a battle that lasted 15 hours. The timing of Israel's huge operation in the Gaza Strip, a day after the roadmap for peace was published, prompted Washington to issue a rare call for restraint on its ally. Tempers flared up in Gaza following the raid, with crowds of demonstrators rejecting new Palestinian Premier Mahmoud Abbas and the roadmap. The military wing of Hamas, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, issued a statement warning against any attempts to disarm the group, responding to Abbas's pledge to rid the Palestinian territories of unauthorized weapons. And the Israeli army has demolished the houses of 2 Palestinian resistance fighters killed in an attempted attack on a West Bank Jewish settlement outpost earlier this week. Israeli and Palestinian sources said Israeli troops dynamited on Thursday night the houses of Azhar and Mahmoud Hanani in Beit Furik, east of Nablus. The two men were killed on Tuesday after they tried to infiltrate a wildcat outpost on a hill near a Jewish settlement. Palestinian sources said Azhar was a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, while Mahmoud was a member of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The houses were home to 13 people. Israel's policy of deterrent house demolitions has seen up to 200 homes destroyed since last summer, drawing condemnation from rights groups which regard it as collective punishment. Meanwhile, in pre-dawn sweeps across the occupied territories, Friday, the Israeli army arrested 22 Palestinians, 10 in the West Bank and 12 in the Gaza Strip. And in another development, the Israeli army said its forces pulled out of Tul Karam in the northern West Bank after an incursion into the Palestinian autonomous town.
Syria prepared Friday to host U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell amid mounting U.S. pressure to end its support for resistance groups, keeping the door open for dialogue but making clear it would not compromise on certain issues, mainly on the Golan Heights occupied by Israel. Powell, due to arrive in Damascus later in the day, is to press Damascus to consider deep U.S. concerns about alleged support for so-called terrorist groups and the pursuit of alleged chemical weapons in the light of the changes in the region. While rejecting the charges, Syria insists the root of all problems in the region is the Israeli occupation of Arab lands. Powell made clear he had minimal expectations with regard to the success of his talks in Damascus. He's also due in Beirut Saturday after a short stop in Tirana.
Even while still on his way to the Middle East, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell revealed almost all the issues he would evoke with officials in Syria and later on in Lebanon. Syria remains his most challenging stop. While in Madrid and during a joint press conference with his Spanish counterpart Ana Palacio, Powell said he would encourage Syria to review the changes that took place in the region and to take a look at some of their past policies and see whether those policies seem to be relevant in light of the new changed situation. Powell said he would press Damascus to address deep U.S. concerns about Syria's support to Hezbollah, pursuit of alleged chemical weapons, and the alleged harboring of fugitive Iraqi officials. Washington aims at neutralizing all groups in the region that resist the Israeli occupation of Arab lands, labeling them as terror organizations. But many in the Arab world, primarily Syria, insist that groups like Hezbollah are legitimate and have nothing to do with terrorism. Powell also said there would be a candid and straightforward discussion that would surely cover up Wednesday's release of the so-called roadmap for Middle East peace. Lebanese governmental sources made clear that during Powell's several hours stay in Lebanon, he will discuss the situation in southern Lebanon, especially the presence of the Islamic resistance there. Ahead of Powell's arrival, Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk al-Shara paid a brief visit to Lebanon, during which he met Lebanese President Emil Lahoud besides several senior officials. Shara said he had come to deliver a letter to President Lahoud from President Bashar al-Assad and to discuss with him Colin Powell's visit to the region. In a joint press briefing with his Lebanese counterpart John Abaid, Shara made clear that Damascus is ready for dialogue but not for U.S. demands.
Hezbollah is a political party integrated into the Lebanese social fabric. The Lebanese themselves say that. Moreover, what have others to do with matters that concern our region? In the absence of peace and with the permanent presence of occupation, eyes should be turned toward the Israeli occupation before looking at those who are fighting against that occupation. We will welcome Mr. Powell to Damascus with pleasure and with the appropriate hospitality. He can put to us his ideas within the framework of dialogue and explain his views on events in the region. We will respond to these points without a spirit of aggressiveness or responding to others' demands. I will not respond to any question about demands, because no one has demanded anything of us. We have faith in dialogue and not in the presentation of a list of demands.
For his part, Abed reiterated that the Syrian presence in Lebanon is legitimate and is a matter solely between the two countries.
We look at what's called military presence in Lebanon as legitimate, necessary and temporary. It is a joint Lebanese and Syrian need. When President Jacques Chirac came to Lebanon, he put this issue in the context of a comprehensive settlement in the Middle East. There would be contacts with Paris to clarify matters and put them in their proper perspective, in a spirit of cooperation and of a special relationship with France.
With the joint Syrian-Lebanese stance made clear even before Powell's arrival to the region, this same stadium and its Syrian equivalent will surely deliver the same position on the U.S. allegations during or after Powell's tour.
That dangerous work still lies ahead in the so-called war on terrorism, and that other so-called outlaw regimes could be confronted. He did not formally declare the hostilities over in Iraq, as U.S. occupation troops still face resistance and mounting anti-U.S. sentiment.
U.S. President George W. Bush late Thursday declared the war against Iraq one victory in a campaign to stamp out so-called terrorism. Bush sought to give the U.S. a closure to the fighting while avoiding a wide-scale claim of overall victory. Experts said the U.S. president did not declare a formal end to hostilities because doing so would obligate the United States under international law to set free an estimated 6,000 Iraqi prisoners of war and would complicate the hunt for Saddam Hussein, which would no longer be considered a military mission.
The war on terror is not over, yet it is not endless. We do not know the day of final victory, but we have seen the turning of the tide. No act of the terrorists will change our purpose or weaken our resolve or alter their fate. Their cause is lost. Free nations will press on to victory.
Over the objections of many nations, Washington attacked Iraq on March 20th because of its alleged weapons of mass destruction. So far, no such weapons have been found. Outlining his principles of the so-called U.S. war on terror, Bush reiterated his foreign policy principles, promising to target anyone who plans attacks against the United States and any country that supports what he called terrorists. Though his administration has accused both Iran and Syria of supporting so-called terrorism, the U.S. president did not mention them in his speech. However, he delivered a broad and ominous warning that would encompass both.
The liberation of Iraq is a crucial advance in the campaign against terror. We've removed an ally of al-Qaeda and cut off a source of terrorist funding. And this much is certain. No terrorist network will gain weapons of mass destruction from the Iraqi regime because the regime is no more. The enemies of freedom are not idle, and neither are we. Our government has taken unprecedented measures to defend the homeland, and we will continue to hunt down the enemy before he can strike.
Although Bush claimed that combat operations in Iraq have ended, more than 150,000 U.S. troops remain in the country. More than 12,000 are in Baghdad alone. Others are distributed all over the country, particularly oil fields and Shiite-populated areas, as well as in Nasiriyah. On the streets of this city, Bush's announcement was met with caution as residents see U.S. intervention as nothing more than an occupation of their country.
No, it's not safe. Many buildings have been looted and people are unsafe. They worry about their future. The people who work in the government have no salary. So now there are many districts in the town that have no pure water or electricity. Where is safety? The war is aimed at the military operation, but after that they try to establish a banana government to facilitate their interests.
While the end of U.S. hostilities in Iraq was not formally announced, the country remains a highly volatile place. Iraqis engage in daily battles with U.S. occupation forces. The last was Thursday's grenade attack that injured 7 U.S. soldiers in the town of Fallujah, some 50 kilometers west of Baghdad. This was an act of revenge after U.S. troops there shot some 19 Iraqi civilian demonstrators a few days earlier.
United States and Iran are sending warning messages to each other. As American Marines were patrolling the Iranian-Iraqi borders, Iran warned the U.S. soldiers not to enter its borders. Meanwhile, Washington warned Tehran not to intervene in domestic Iraqi issues in the wake of the anti-American Shiites protests in Karbala. The report of Salih Al-Azraq.
بعد اختراقها لأسوار بغداد وللخط الأحمر الذي وضعه النظام العراقي.
After the U.S. had penetrated the walls of Baghdad and the red line that was created by the former Iraqi regime before its collapse, U.S. forces are now facing a new red line.
حدده وزير الخارجية الإيراني بالحد الفاصل بين
The Iranian foreign minister Kamal Karazi defined it as the dividing line between Iran and Iraq. Karazi joined the French foreign minister Dominique de Villepin in a press conference where he warned the American Marines not to enter the Iranian borders. He said, "We are not going to have our hands tied. We will defend our borders." The American Central Command explained that the U.S. military presence along the borders is not in preparation for possible incursions. In an intimidating announcement, the U.S. occupation forces declared that the U.S. patrol forces are there to protect the sovereignty of Iraq. While Tehran is warning the U.S. not to penetrate its borders, Washington declared that it is worried about the infiltration of what it called Iranian collaborators in Iraq, pointing to Falik Badr members, and warned Iran not to intervene in Iraq. However, the Iranian foreign minister tried to remind Washington that Falik Badr is an exclusively Iraqi organization and said that every Iraqi should have the right to live in Iraq and participate in the process of forming their new government. The escalating tensions between Tehran and Washington made people in the region more worried. People are afraid that the U.S. is swollen with pride because of its easy and decisive victory in Iraq and may start a new incursion in Iran. If we were to give the French minister the benefit of the doubt, we may consider the visit of the French minister to Iran and the meeting with President Khatami as an attempt to preempt any possible tension in the region. Nonethelse, de Villepin asked Tehran to open its nuclear sites for surprise and to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, Tehran is wondering about the timing and the motives behind the Russian Minister of Nuclear Energy's declarations that he is worried about the recent nuclear activities in Iran. This indicates that Moscow is now behind Washington's accusations against Iran. Iran, the country that watched the experience of the Iraqi regime when it was abandoned by its citizens once the war started, is now preparing its internal front for the worst. Meanwhile, Tehran declared that it had pardoned the 5 Iranian Jews who were imprisoned for spying for Israel.
وأعلنت العفو عن اليهود الإيرانيين الخمسة الذين كانوا مسجونين بتهمة التجسس لصالح.
However, Washington preempted Tehran's intentions to pardon Khalid fighters by signing a ceasefire agreement with them in which they will be able to keep their weapons and continue their war against the Iranian government. Why not, if Washington's interests dictate that its former enemy should become its dear friend, even if this new friend was included in Washington's list of terrorist organizations?
To mark the martyrdom anniversary of Imam Reza, the 8th Imam of Prophet Muhammad's infallible household, Iranians on Friday held mourning functions across the nation. Tehran's interim Friday prayer leader Ayatollah Ahmad Jannati reiterates that the presence of U.S. military forces in Iraq is in contradiction with international laws and regulations.
Addressing thousands of worshippers at Tehran University campus, Ayatollah Jannati noted the United States is not committed even to its claims pertaining to democracy and that it has ridiculed human rights. Terming Washington's hegemonic policy in the world as shameful, Tehran's interim Friday prayer leader reiterated the U.S., with its military attack on Iraq and its occupation of that country, has become notorious in the globe, adding it's the oppressed Iraqi nation who is facing numerous disasters. Ayatollah Jannati then underlined the Iraqi people's real freedom and the establishment of an Islamic rule in that country can be materialized just through unity, setting mosques as bases, following the clerics, besides incessant struggle to drive out the occupiers. Speaking on the terrorist grouplet of MKO, Tehran's interim Friday prayer leader said that terrorist grouplet led a disgraceful life under the ousted regime of Saddam Hussein and now have joined hands with the U.S. Ayatollah Jannati meanwhile called sheer lie the U.S. claim of anti-terrorism campaign, which it is so friendly treating the MKO, which has a long record of terrorist acts.
Iraqi clerics demand an end to conflicts in Fallujah, 50 kilometers west of Baghdad. This is while unrest is still going on in Fallujah following the U.S. forces' killing of a number of the city's residents. Staging everyday rallies, Fallujah residents are calling for occupiers' withdrawal from the city. This comes while U.S. military officials have announced they will remain in Fallujah to establish security in the city. The Iraqi people's protest to U.S. presence on Iraq's soil is also reportedly on rise. Reports from Baghdad say there have been a number of huge explosions near one of the ousted Saddam Hussein's palaces. U.S. President George W. Bush on Friday said that American forces will remain in Iraq until their objectives are achieved. Meanwhile, shortages of medicine and medical facilities in hospitals of Basra has brought about hardship in the patient's treatment. Hospital officials in Basra have announced that invading forces have not provided any assistance in that regard. United Nations spokesperson for humanitarian affairs expresses concern over the on-rise death of Iraqi civilians, children in particular. The official added, based on the conducted research, about 3 to 4 Iraqi children every day lose their lives in Kirkuk due to ground mines explosion there. The Swiss Public Prosecutor's Office on Friday declared that the Association for Solidarity with Iraqi War Victims has filed a lawsuit against the U.S. President George W. Bush and British Premier Tony Blair for committing war crimes in Iraq. According to an AFP report from Bern, the Swiss Ministry of Justice has demanded the Geneva-based association to submit to the court the necessary related documents. In Belgium as well, a lawyer representing the relatives of war victims in Iraq is to file a complaint against the U.S. Central Command Chief, General Tommy Franks, on his war crimes during the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq. Now a brief look at some other important news. The slump in the influence of U.S. media is one of the realities of the U.S.-British waged war on Iraq. That, according to Iran's Culture and Islamic Guidance Minister Ahmad Massoud Jami, who also said on Friday the U.S. did not manage to attract the support of the public opinion, even in the invading forces countries. The Iranian minister then pointed out the variety of news dissemination during the war on Iraq indicates that the time is over for absolute monopoly in the field of media.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation,